Thanks, Katiana, and thank you so much to Representative Wexton for joining me today. Thank you to everybody who joined, and I just want to especially thank her for her leadership on human rights and particularly as it pertains to the Olympics. So the bill that we're introducing together, well, before I get into what it would actually do, just to set the table, the International Olympic Committee is registered as a 501c4, where not to get into the weeds of the law, but essentially in that designation receives a tax-exempt status because it is a social welfare organization. We think, or certainly I do, as it pertains now to hosting the Beijing Olympics, particularly after years now of members of Congress and importantly over 200 international human rights organizations practically begging and pleading with the IOC, including the minority groups that are currently suffering under a genocide, begging and pleading with the IOC to, first of all, not host the games in China, in Beijing, but once they made that decision to then move the games, given the fact that the atrocities committed by the CCP are only worsening. The evidence of that is clear, indisputable. Documents. By the way, the amount of money that we're talking about is quite significant. NBC's contract for broadcasting alone is reportedly $7.5 billion. And by the way, the IOC has reportedly committed over $800 million to Beijing for infrastructure costs to host the games. Frankly, the IOC is forcing our athletes to choose between their values and choose between being able to compete. So I, for one, don't think they should enjoy that tax-exempt status any longer. The vast majority of the IOC's revenue are from corporate American sponsorships and from benefiting from that tax-exempt status. And we have to, enough is enough with hosting the games and putting our athletes in this position in these types of autocratic regimes. So while we may not be able to, unfortunately, affect their decision in just a few weeks, we hope to affect it going forward. I think with that, I'll stop and just pass it over to Representative Wexton so that we have time to get to questions.
Well, I want to thank you, Representative Waltz, for your leadership on this issue. It's been wonderful working with you. So my passion for human rights in China, and especially with regard to the Uyghurs, first began even before I was sworn into Congress. I attended a seminar or a meeting at one of my local mosques where Uyghur Muslims came and talked about the impact on their families. They talked about how their families had been disappeared, about the sinicization of hundreds of years old memorials and buildings in Xinjiang, and how the atrocities that were taking place in that area. So I knew that when I came to Congress, I was going to have a platform and an ability to do something about it. And so that's been something I've been very passionate about. I was an original co-sponsor of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I'm so pleased that finally passed both houses of Congress and has been signed into law. I joined Representative Waltz in asking the IOC to move the Olympics from Beijing in 2022. Unfortunately, they declined to do that. But as the Olympics were approaching, I serve on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and we held a hearing with the Olympic sponsors and really pressed them on what they were going to do to either get out of the Olympics or to engage in counter programming and make sure that they spoke out for human rights in China. And of course, when Peng Shuai disappeared after speaking out, Representative Waltz and I teamed up on a resolution condemning the IOC for being essentially accomplices to the CCP's disappearing of her and their abuses of her. And that passed the Congress unanimously. And that all has led to the IOC Act, which is the act that we're introducing today. It is very clear to me as the IOC continues in these human rights abuses, as an accomplice to the human rights abuses of the CCP, that they are not a charitable organization. that they are not deserving of tax-exempt status, and that the U.S. taxpayer dollars should not be subsidizing their actions. So I feel very strongly that this is a very good bill, and I hope it will pass, and I look forward to taking any questions that y'all have.
Katiana, before we go to questions, can I just add one more point, in that, the IOC hasn't always behaved in this manner, where they were just, completely turned a blind eye to women's rights, to mass rape and torture, to mass incarceration, and these types of abuses. In fact, in the 1960s, they made a principled stand when it came to apartheid in South Africa, and forbid any Olympics from taking place in South Africa, but went even a step further and banned South African athletes from participating in any Olympic Games anywhere for multiple decades. Imagine if they took that principled stand and not only moved the games out of Beijing, but said China's Olympic team cannot participate anywhere in the world. So why we're taking a stand in one case and not the other, it befuddles me. The only difference I can reasonably logically point to is the amount of money now involved with the Olympics. And again, just one contract alone in the multiple billions. Again, enough is enough. There is precedent to take a stand. If you're not going to take a stand on a genocide, as defined by multiple administrations and multiple State Departments, with very credible evidence of the type of torture and abuse that's going on, particularly to women. And now you have, as Representative Wexton stated, a credible claim of sexual assault by a senior Chinese official, a vice premier. I mean, again, imagine if you had it from an American tennis star against a vice president of the United States. I think the media, the sports community, the IOC, the American Olympic Committee would all be taking a very different position. But instead, we not only see whitewashing, we see complicity with the cover-up and the coercion that's going on to that poor woman. I just couldn't. I just can't agree with, and there's a lot of disagreement in Washington these days across the aisle, but I'm so proud that this is a bipartisan effort on our part, because it really comes down to the fundamentals of our values that the IOC clearly no longer shares. But with that, I'll get off my box and we'll go to questions. Thanks so much, Katiana. Katiana, I can't hear Scott. I don't know if it's just on my end. Because take the next question. You want to try the next one and see if
Scott gets his technical difficulties worked out.
Yeah, no worries.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay. For either representatives, when you talk about revoking tax-exempt status, how much money are you talking about this costing the IOC? And a second question, are you prepared for the IOC to respond to this in its usual way by saying it's an apolitical organization?
So I will say that the U.S. tax return, the federal tax return for the IOC in 2018 was $2 billion. So we're not talking about, it's not nothing. This is a substantial amount of money. It would be a real penalty for them, and I think that they would feel the pain from that. And they can say it's apolitical, but when they are acting as an accomplice to the PRC's human rights abuses and genocide, it's anything but political. It's absolutely, it's anything but apolitical. It is absolutely political. They are making a political decision to side with the PRC and the human rights abuses and the genocide instead of their own credo of human rights.
Well said. Couldn't agree more. That's my understanding as well. That we'll be looking. I mean, if you look at roughly half of that figure, or even a third of that figure, that's a significant amount of money, and it oddly lines up with about the amount of money that the IOC has poured into Beijing.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now? This is Scott Powers.
Yes,
Gotcha, Scott. Yeah, thanks.
First, thank you so much for having this this event and taking my question here. Representative Wexton, you had made reference to the possibility of counter-programming. I'm wondering what kind of counter-programming might make a difference, and have you heard any kind of assurances or even possibilities of that during the games?
Well, when I met with NBC Universal about this very topic, and the USOC came and joined us as well in our meeting, I indicated that I would love to see some counter programming from them, because we all remember 2008 when everybody thought that it would help open up China, and they gave that as a good reason to allow them to host the Olympics then. And if anything, they've doubled down on their human rights abuses and genocide since that time. So I think it's very important that whoever's hosting these Olympics make it clear that this is not, what I don't want to see is Hoda and the crowd from NBC gushing about what a wonderful spectacle it is, and not talking about what's actually happening behind the scenes with the genocide that is taking place in Xinjiang.
Yeah, I would just say it's also, we're looking for clarity from the IOC, and I just signed on to an effort to seek that clarity. I don't want to get ahead of it, but the IOC, in terms of athletes, a year ago, they assured us, a number of members of Congress, that in line with their charter, while the athletes can, according to the IOC, should not make political statements on the medal stand per se, that they should be able to, in their own private capacity, in press conferences, in their hotels, or in other places. Now the Chinese Olympic Authority is making it clear that that is not welcome and in violation of Chinese law. So where does the IOC stand on supporting its own, its own bylaws and basic freedom of speech? Not to mention, a number of us have repeatedly requested that either NBC not broadcast, or if they do, not censor, which, as a U.S. broadcasting journalistic entity, one would certainly hope that they don't do. But again, what's the common variable here is the amount of money involved, and that's from the sponsors to NBC to IOC and across the board. And as the NBA basketball player and as Cantor Freedom rightly said, no amount of gold medals and no amount of money are worth your values and your basic principles. We'll see if they hold up to that.
And if I may add to that, Representative Waltz, one of the concerns that I have, and I know that you share, is that the IOC is not going to protect those athletes who do choose to speak out. If anything, that's what I was concerned about after the way that they treated Peng Shuai. So it is very, very concerning, because ultimately that would be the IOC's responsibility to help protect those athletes who do choose to speak out. And I'm not at all confident that they will do so.
Yeah, and not to belabor this, but a common refrain has been, because I did introduce a measure calling for a full boycott a year ago when it became clear the IOC was not going to move the games, and a common retort is to refer to Mexico City. Let's let the athletes compete. Let's let them use this as a opportunity to highlight the atrocities, and the athletes themselves will do that. Well, the difference is, one, the Mexican government didn't have the ability or a willingness to fully censor back in the 1960s. The Chinese government does. And number two, I would not put it past them at all to put our athletes in prison. And so it's not only the IOC, but I think the U.S. Olympic Committee has a responsibility. And frankly, I don't know that Representative Wexton would agree with us, but I think the administration, who has rightly called for a diplomatic boycott, but not a full, should share some responsibility. I'm very concerned about the safety of our athletes if they rightly speak out about these abuses.
Thank you very much.
Hi, yes, hopefully you can hear me. Thank you for doing the call. Appreciate the opportunity to ask a quick question. I was just wondering whether you all have had conversations with leadership about bringing this to the floor, whether it would be as a standalone measure or perhaps part of the some version of the House version of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which of course deals with competition with China, or if there was some other way to do that. Thank you.
I'll defer to Representative Wexton on that one since they're in the majority. I will say I'm holding out some hope that an omnibus gets put together, and that could be a vehicle. We've certainly had some initial conversations on our side.
As will I, and this is something that's very important to me, and I know that it's very important to the speaker and a number of other folks in leadership as well. So I will continue to press the issue.
Yeah, I think that's me. It's feeling kind of Politico. Hi, thank you, Representatives Wexton and Waltz. Really appreciate this opportunity. Two quick questions. I just wonder whether we really need your ideas on sort of threading the needle between the IOC and its funding lines, because the IOC can't operate without corporate sponsors, and the top TOP corporate sponsors pay like $100 million for every games, and there's 5 big U.S. Fortune 500 companies on that list. Do you guys have any type of plan or in terms of addressing that issue? And I have one other quick question directly to Representative Wexton. Representative Wexton, President Biden announced a diplomatic boycott of the games on December 6th. To date, only 8 other countries have joined that. It looks like a pretty anemic embrace of this move to have some kind of symbolic pushback against Chinese government abusive policies in Xinjiang and elsewhere. What's your assessment of the diplomatic boycott? Is it a wasted opportunity? Could more be done? Thank you so much.
Well, more could always be done, but this is the situation we have. And I wouldn't call it necessarily that anemic. I mean, we do have a number of allies, the UK, Canada, Australia, Denmark, New Zealand, Belgium, Lithuania, and Japan have joined us in the diplomatic boycott. And that's not insignificant. But yes, there is more that could be done, but this is what we have right now. And I do hope that a lot of folks will speak out as the Genocide Olympics take place.
From my perspective, I would have liked to have seen more. As I stated earlier, I introduced a measure calling for a full boycott for the variety of reasons we've already listed, not just the genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, but also the ongoing persecution of the Tibetans, the stamping out of freedom in Hong Kong. I mean, if I just had to list a number of places, the exact opposite of the ideals of the Olympics and of where the games should be hosted, particularly after we gave China a shot and the CCP a chance to improve their record in 2008. And the Bush administration accepted that. Those assurances, as did hundreds of human rights organizations, and their behavior has only gotten worse under Xi, and they're more emboldened. But to your point on the corporate sponsors, look, it's also has a national security perspective here, in that a number of the sponsors, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Intel, have significant Defense Department contracts. And on the one hand, on the one hand, is making significant revenue from the United States military, but on the other hand, is pouring billions into their greatest adversary. And so I introduced a measure to say enough is enough. It's time for some corporate patriotism. It's time for some basic values. It's time for them to live up to the ESG, the corporate governance claim that they proudly espouse. And all of those entities actively lobbied to kill that amendment. And those lobbying reports are out and available now. So again, enough with the hypocrisy. And by the way, that's not a stretch. The Chinese civil military fusion program actively seeks to apply investments in its civilian infrastructure to its military infrastructure. And then finally, on the IOC piece, look, the U.S. Olympic Committee is a 501c3. These companies can sponsor and support our athletes directly. A number of them do. Actually, it does not have to be through the IOC. And certainly when the IOC is behaving in the way that we're seeing and that we just saw with the Peng Shuai episode.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. I'm curious, does this bill envision that the IOC would be stripped of its nonprofit status into perpetuity, or would it only be for these games because of the focus on China?
It's in perpetuity at this point, right? I think we need to see the IOC return to the values that it espoused when it took a stand against apartheid. And again, as I think Representative Wexton rightly said, in this case, silence is, it's not just silence is complicity, it's active collaboration. I mean, we just had an Olympic athlete with a credible accusation of sexual assault and harassment against a senior figure, and there's not even an senior figure in China, and there's not even an investigation, much less the coercion that's clearly going on. That an senior IOC official, if not the entire committee, was complicit. And so, our vision is that behavior needs to change. And the taxpayer certainly doesn't need to be funding it. By the way, there is a provision that it would be with revenue in the bill, revenues over $100 million. The Paralympics Committee would not be affected.
I do have a follow-up. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. For Representative Wexton, could you give us a little more detail, perhaps, about your meeting with NBC and whether, they talked about whether they may be doing any counter-programming or showing a less, giving us a less than glorious image of these games in China?
Well, they were less than forthcoming about what their entire plans are to do, but they did make it very clear that they stand for human rights and that they are not afraid to speak out if they do see anything that is happening that is untoward. But I think that they just wanted to make it clear that they had these contracts, that they were unbreakable, and that they weren't going to change them.
Doesn't sound too hopeful.
And if I could just raise one other point, Representative Wexton, raised the Uyghur Forced Prevention Labor Act, which I was also thrilled to see finally passed into law. And it does raise an interesting question with a number of the sponsors who are apparel makers, including the IOC uniforms, that, from the best we can see, they certainly haven't certified otherwise, very likely was made with modern day slave labor.
Right, that is. And the CECC, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, did send a letter requesting either certification that it had not been used that it has not been produced with slave labor, or that no cotton had been sourced from Xinjiang or anything like that, and we have not heard back yet.